Good morning, folks. Glad to have you with us back in my backyard as we look at God's Word this morning. And there's a lot of talk about being compliant these days. Being compliant with the standards that the government has set down for us in regards to COVID-19 and the spread of this virus, or the non-spread of this virus. And there's a lot of rules that they've made in order to be compliant. Standing 6 feet apart or 2 meters apart, and lines are painted on the sidewalks or on tile floors in the stores to allow so many customers in, or having to stand that far apart when we're going through to pay for our items that we're going to get, and you stand in line there, and everything's 6 meters apart, and we have the cashiers with the glass in front of them, and a little window that you can just slip your card through and tap the machine, and then they wipe the machine down with some disinfectant in between each client that comes through, or each customer that comes through. And then there's the talk of, do we wear masks? Whoops, wrong kind of mask. Or do we wear masks? All right, and there's all that, and I see some people sometimes, and it makes me kind of giggle a little bit. They're driving along in their car, and they're all by themselves, and they're wearing a mask. And I'm thinking, who are you going to give it to, or who are you going to catch it from when you're the only person in your car? But at any rate, there's all this work and this talk of being compliant, and it takes on the connotation of being compliant is, I'm doing my part. Okay, I'm either doing my part, or I'm doing all that is required of me to help stop the spread of this virus and so forth. But my question for you is being compliant in the Christian life what God requires of us? Many Christians, they think so, and if they don't say it out loud, they scream it with what they do and how they act in their actual lives. And I do what I'm supposed to do. I say the right words. I attend church regularly. I even tithe. But is that what it's about? All right. We're going to take a close look today at two men in particular, a priest named Jehoiada and a king, little king that well, he was little at the beginning, a little king named Joash, and we looked a little bit at him last week, and how his grandmother Athaliah, evil, wicked woman, and actually he uses that term for her, and we'll see that in a little bit here in our Bible. But this evil, wicked woman wiped out all of her grandchildren and everybody so that she could take the throne. And Jehoiada and his wife Josheba, I'm not going to say it right, but his wife, the great woman that she was, she helped to hide him in the temple until he was 7 years old, we found, and then Jehoiada brought him forth and anointed him king and crowned him king, and we saw that last week. But if we take a look in your Bibles, please, to 2 Kings chapter 11. 2 Kings chapter 11 in verse 21, the very last verse in that chapter. And it says, 7 years old was Joash, or Jehoash, same guy, when he began to reign. He was just 7, all right? They grabbed him when he was about 1, just a toddler, and they hid him for 6 years in the temple. And he was there, so obviously a 7-year-old can't run a nation, all right? So he needed some guidance, and that's what they finally, Israel was always bad kings, as you remember, but Judah finally had it where, the king and the priesthood could work together and govern the nation under God. And they had a great man in Jehoiada, all right? Now the first thing that he did, he was along guiding this young king, all right? And the first thing he did was he get things off on the right foot. Look at 2 Kings chapter 11, all right, in verse number 17. It says, and Jehoiada made a covenant between the Lord and the king and the people, that they should be the Lord's people, between the king also and the people. He made a covenant and started things off on the right foot. It wasn't just, we're going to sing God Save the King here and anoint him king. No, he's making a covenant between the king, between the people, between God, all right, that we are going to have a nation run under God. And that's the right start. That's where everything should start, when in our lives, when we decide what we're going to do for a living as a young person. I was thinking this week, as decisions that I made as a young teenager, how that affected my entire life. And thinking at 16, I decided to take out this girl who was a cashier at Dominion grocery store, and 40 something years later, here we are. Okay, 12 grandchildren, 2 sons, just getting 3 sons, and and we the decisions that we make, if we're looking, whatever decisions we make, we should look to God to help us with those decisions, especially the larger decisions. Okay, what color socks you wear doesn't matter. Okay, but I'm saying, any other, where you're going to work, it makes a difference as to, God, do you want me to work here or not? Do you want me to live here or not? What do you want me to do? And if things are based upon God, we can follow it, and He can help us in those things, and be assured that we're in His will and doing what He wants us to do, where He wants us to do it. And that is so vitally important. So Jehoiada starts the reign of little Joash off on the right foot in making a covenant with the people and with God, and saying that we are going to do things God's way, And we see here in look at chapter 12, after it talks about when, in verse 1, just talks about who Joash was and his mother and so forth. And verse number 2, it says, "And Joash did that which was right in the sight of the Lord all his days, wherein Jehoiada the priest instructed him." So you can see that he was following Jehoiada, and he was doing exactly what God wanted him to do as long as Jehoiada was there. But the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and burned incense in the high places. Now, I looked a little bit at it's always kind of bothered me. What are these high places? And from what I can gather, all right, the high places it wasn't places where they worshipped idols. All right, it was local. I hate to use the word shrines, but as local areas where they would go and they would sacrifice and they would burn incense to God. Now, the real plan, God's real idea here, was that they went to the temple in Jerusalem. But the temple in Jerusalem, because of Athaliah and her son Jehoram, who is the king, and they were both wicked, it greatly discouraged people from coming to Jerusalem, to the point where it was a fearful thing. So they set up these other things. And I'm not saying that it's right what they did, okay? Because as we see here in verse 2 here, that there's the word "but." It shouldn't have been there, but it wasn't that they were worshiping idols. If you take a look in 2 Chronicles chapter 24, 2 Chronicles 24 verse 7, I love the way that they describe her here. It says, "For the sons of Athaliah, that wicked woman," all right, she was vile, wicked woman, but it says, "For the sons of Athaliah, that wicked woman, had broken up the house of God, and also all the dedicated things of the house of the Lord did they bestow upon Balaam." So they had not entirely demolished the temple. All right, we know that Joash lived there from the time he was one, Joash. Okay, from the time he was one until he became the king. All right, and the priests were still there, but that place was run down, and it was vandalized by the princes, okay, Athaliah's sons, and so forth, that it made worshiping there difficult. So the people set up these other places, these high places. Although that was not God's plan, all right, it was something that they did, not an entirely wrong thing that they did, but it was a wrong thing that they did. If you can follow their idea was to continue worshiping God where they could not do it in the temple, or at least not as well as they would have liked to have. But it still was not the way that God wanted things. He wanted the worship in the temple. Hence the word "but." Okay, but the high places were not taken away. But that's what the high places were. They were for sacrificing to God, but that was not God's main design here. It was to come to the temple. All right. Moving on, all right. Some time passed as Joash was the king, and I'm not. It doesn't tell us how much time had passed. It does tell us the second stage of this, but Joash wanted to rebuild the temple, all right, and to get it back to its original glory and so forth, so that it could be used in a good way. And that was his nursery. That was where he was raised. So there was definitely a part of that rang true in his heart. But so what he did was he ordered the priests and the Levites that were to go out, and they were to collect some money from the people that they could use to rebuild the temple. And these things, if we would see some of the laws that were laid down in Moses' day, there was a census money that was to be collected on occasions, and that you could read about that in Exodus chapter 30. There was trespass offerings where money would be collected. You can read about that in Leviticus chapter 5. And there was personal vows that would have to be paid, and you could read about that in Leviticus 22. And these different things would be avenues of revenue, that they could use, and then he was going to reallocate this money. Joash wanted to reallocate this money into a building program. Well, it didn't work. Okay, I don't know if the priests just didn't, and the Levites just didn't go out and collect the money, or whatever happened, but some time had passed, and it tells us that that I believe it was the 23rd year of his reign. Okay, so he'd have been 30. All right, and that he says, why isn't this being done? You know, and he changed the plan to Plan B. Okay, and they made a chest at his command in 2 Chronicles chapter 24 and verse number 8. It says, and at the king's commandment they made a chest and set it without at the gate of the house of the Lord. And they set this out here, and it tells us in 2 Kings that Jehoiada bored a hole in the top of this chest so that it was there, and it sat there, and they made a proclamation all throughout Judah and all the land to bring money in and to bring in your free will offerings in, and we're going to rebuild the temple. Well, the people got excited, all right, and they brought the money in. It tells us, it says that they gathered money in abundance, all right. And it was a great time where they had the money that was there to do that. And it's interesting that when they took the money and they used it, they didn't, the men that it talks there about that were there, they were so faithful, the carpenters and the masons and all the other builders, the stone cutters and so forth that were there. It says they were so faithful they didn't even really track the money. Okay, they just took the money and they paid these men, and they were faithful in paying these men, and these men were faithful, hardworking men, and they rebuilt the temple. All right, and they had the money to do that. And it's interesting when we look at this. I want you to look in 2 Kings chapter 12 in verse 13, and it says, howbeit there were not made for the house of the Lord bowls of silver, snuffers, basins, trumpets, any vessels of gold or vessels of silver of the money that was brought into the house of the Lord, but they gave that to the workmen and repaired therewith the house of the Lord. They said, we're not going to do all the furnishings, we're going to get this building all set up. And they collected the money, and they focused on paying these men. But you know what's interesting is that the Bible is not contradicting itself. It's saying this was what they were going to do, but when it was all done, take a look in 2 Chronicles. These are parallel passages, all right? There's a little more detail actually in 2 Chronicles than there is in 2 Kings. But in 2 Chronicles chapter 24, you're going to flip back and forth between these two chapters, okay? 2 Kings 12, 2 Chronicles 24. In 2 Chronicles 24 and verse 14, it says, and when they had finished it, they paid the workmen. They got the work done. They brought the rest of the money before the king and Jehoiada, whereof were made vessels for the house of the Lord, even vessels to minister, and to offer withal, and spoons, and vessels of gold and silver, and they offered burnt offerings in the house of the Lord continually all the days of Jehoiada. All right, they had the money left over to do all these other things that Athaliah's sons had desecrated, and they had given to Balaam and so forth. And we see that if we were to back up into chapter 11, we'd see where they ridded the country of Balaam and his temple, and Mattan the high priest, or Mattan, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, M-A-T-T-A-N, and they got rid of the high priest and destroyed their idols and everything, and they went back to worshiping God, okay? And it is interesting here when you see this, and they offered, in 24:14 of 2 Chronicles, they offered burnt offerings in the house of the Lord continually all the days of Jehoiada. All the days, okay? And there was peace and prosperity all the days that Jehoiada counseled King Joash. For many, many years, there was peace and there was prosperity because the country was focused on serving and doing things God's way, which is how our lives should be, all right? In 2 Chronicles chapter 24 and verse 2, it says, "And Joash did that what was right in the sight of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada the priest." Doesn't that sound like a great epitaph? Here he is, he did what was right all the days of Jehoiada the priest. But Jehoiada died. In 24 verse 15 there in 2 Chronicles, it tells us that Jehoiada was 130 years old when he died. And in verse 16 it says, "And they buried him in the city of David," get this, "among the kings, because he had done good in Israel both toward God and toward his house." Because of how godly this man was, he was a priest, okay? But they buried him with the kings. That's how highly respected he was. And we look, and we have a tendency to skip over some stuff in the Bible when we read it. We read, oh, well, Jehoiada was 130 years old. That, big deal he was 130 years old. I mean, people live to be 900 years old in the Bible. So 130, that doesn't mean anything. Well, it does. If you do remember that, yeah, people live to be 900 years old. Methuselah, the oldest recorded man, at 969 years, that was before the flood. And after the flood, people still lived a long time, but you can see how it rapidly decreases, okay? Abraham's father's name was Terah. He lived to be 205. Now, that's a long time, but it's a far cry from 969, all right? We're like talking like 20%, all right, of how old he was. And so Abraham's father, Terah, was 205. Abraham lived to be 175. See the drop? Abraham had Isaac, Isaac had Jacob, Jacob lived to be 147. From 205, 175, 147, Jacob's son, Joseph, wonderful story of Joseph. I love the story of Joseph. Lived to be 110. And it works its way down to David. And David, in 1 Chronicles 29:28, it speaks of him and it says, "And he died in a good old age, full of days, riches, and honor, and Solomon his son reigned in his stead." You know how old David was? 70. And he died in a good old age. I don't really consider 70 old anymore, okay, as I'm closing up closer to that now. But you know what? You can see how it's dropped off. This is a while later, okay? A while later. Jehoiada was 130. He was almost twice as old as David, okay? Why did Jehoiada live to be 130? Because God had a purpose for him. He had a heart for God, and he gave it all to God. 130 years worth to God. And God extended his life, I believe, because he had a job to do. It was up to Jehoiada and to his wife and to maintain that Davidic line for the king, for Jesus to be born. All right, he was the only one left, Joash was, all right? And God had a great purpose for him. He had a great heart for God, okay? And Jehoiada dies at 130. That would put Joash into his probably 45-ish, 45, 46 years old when Jehoiada dies. The princes of Judah come to Joash, tells us in 2 Chronicles 24:17. And these princes of Judah come to him and they're basically asking him, let's ease up a bit on all of this stuff that Jehoiada had done. All these years, he's lived with him for 45 years, roughly, with Jehoiada. God had prospered the nation the whole time that he counseled him with him. And these guys say, let's forget about what Jehoiada did. We want to worship some idols. And you know what Joash did? He said, okay. He said, okay, let's do that. They left, it tells us, they left the house of the Lord that he had, that it was Joash's idea to rebuild, okay? They left the house of the Lord and they served groves and they served idols, okay? God sent prophets to him and said and told Joash, you got to turn back. What you're doing is wrong. This is wrong. He didn't listen to them. He dismissed them. Finally, God got one other man. His name was Zechariah. He was the son of Jehoiada. And God told Zechariah to go and to talk to Joash. And Zechariah goes in there. He knew him his whole life. You wonder, probably Zechariah had to babysit little Joash when he was little before he became the king. You know, in the temple when he was hidden there, it was Jehoiada's son. They knew him his whole life, and yet this prophet comes to him, and you know what Joash does? He orders him to be stoned. Joash had him stoned. You know, Joash was a great follower, but he was a terrible leader. All right. You know, it's simply not enough. It's simply not enough to know the truth. We must obey the truth from our hearts. And I use that term a lot, and you know, from our hearts and so forth. And you know, I hate for it to get to be one of those things where it's just a line of words, a slogan, a meaningless little term. It's not that. I want you to look in your Bibles in the New Testament, if you will, Ephesians chapter 6, verse number 6. We go to Ephesians 6 and we think, oh yeah, this is a good one. Children, obey their parents in the Lord, for this is good, right? This is right. Here we go. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 6. It's talking about serving God. It says, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as the servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. It's important that it is from the heart, not men pleasers. It seems that Joash was more of a men pleaser. He saw how powerful and influential that Jehoiada the priest was. All the nation of Israel saw how influential and how solid from top to bottom Jehoiada was. He was the same. There was no hypocrisy in Jehoiada. And he loved God, and it was apparent that he loved God and that he was true to God in everything that he did. So much so, like I said, they buried him with the kings, all right? Truth in the mind can lead to obedience, but truth in the heart and obedience from the heart is what produces Christ-like character. It's got to come from the heart. You can get obedience by having some of the truth in your mind, but not Christ-like character. Christ-like character comes from the heart. Doing the will of God, as Ephesians 6:6 says, doing the will of God from the heart. If we only obey out of duty, it is not from the heart. Remember what Jesus said about obeying out of duty? He says, so likewise ye, when ye shall have done all those things which are commanded of you, say, we are unprofitable servants. We have done that which was our duty to do. You know, God calls us here, and Jesus calls us here, if we're doing things strictly out of duty, he says that it's unprofitable. But when we obey out of delight, that is where there is a change of heart. And that is where something that God can use. All right. One of my favorite verses is in Psalms. It's interesting. David wrote so many of the Psalms. And he says, delight thyself also in the Lord, and he shall give thee the desires of thine heart. If we delight in the Lord. You know, you think about David and some of the advice that he gives. You think about some of the influence that he has done. Just even in the temple, we see that the very ground that the temple was built on, David purchased that with his money. The the temple, the things that Solomon used to build the temple, most of that was procured by, see, hear the dogs barking in the background here, sorry about that, but most of the wealth that was used to build the temple was procured by David. Either it came from the battles that he won or out of his own personal treasury. But what we have here, as David says here in Psalm 37:24, he says, delight thyself also in the Lord, and he shall give thee the desires of thine heart. You know, King Joash had every advantage to become a godly man under the tutelage of Jehoiada, but he missed his opportunities. He missed those by not taking the truth, by God's truth, into his heart. You know, Joash was simply compliant to Jehoiada, while Jehoiada was devoted to God. Jehoiada was buried with the kings. You know where Joash was buried with? Not with the kings. Although he started out well, and he followed well, and it looked like, he was doing the right things, obeying, but not obeying from the heart. He was murdered in his own bed by two of his servants. And I'm not saying what they did was right, but they did it to avenge the death of Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada. And they took Joash and they buried him outside, away from the rest of the kings, okay? Couple questions for you. Are you compliant or are you devoted? Do you obey God out of duty, or do you obey God out of delight? Out of delight. Ephesians 6:6. Not with eye service as men pleasers, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. Is it from the heart, or is it out of duty?